Today's lesson is From Yellow Journalism to Fake News. Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Candice.
And so today we're going to be talking about yellow journalism and fake news. Now, these, of course, are both terms that relate to news reporting, the media, and things like that. I think yellow journalism actually goes back quite a few years, but fake news is a term we've heard a lot about in the last few years. It's the more recent form of sort of questionable journalism.
Yes, back in the day, I think journalism originated when two rival newspapers were trying to compete for customers. And so they would come up with all these crazy headlines to grab customers' attention so that they'd buy that publication rather than the competitor's publication.
Exactly right. And today, of course, we have competing ideas, competing political opinions, and that is one of the things that leads to newspapers kind of delivering news that maybe their listeners or their readers want to hear, but it might be not exactly sticking to the truth. So let's find about this history from yellow journalism to fake news as we listen to the first part of today's lesson. From yellow journalism to fake news. The creation of false news content, also known as fake news, is a serious global problem. Thanks in large part to social media, lies about important topics such as the COVID-19 pandemic or the climate crisis are able to spread like wildfire across the internet. However, although today's technology allows fake news to spread faster than ever before, the phenomenon itself is far from modern.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 content， 这个字是名词，指内容、含量、成分或是目录。例如 Though the magazine's design was eye-catching, its content was unremarkable. 虽然那本杂志的设计很吸睛，但却没有什么内容可言。或是 This cereal has a high sugar content, so don't eat too much of it. 这种早餐麦片含糖量高，所以不要吃太多。另外，这个字也可以当作形容词使用，念作 content， 表示满足的或是满意的意思。像是 I'm perfectly content in this little village. I don't need to live in a big city. 我在这个小村落里十分满足，我不需要住在大城市。也可以说 Joyce seems pretty content with her new job. Joyce 似乎对她的新工作非常满意。接着我们看到片语 in large part，指在很大程度上或是多半。举例来说 The museum is funded in large part by donations. 这间博物馆的资金大部分是来自捐款。或是 Most of her rent is covered in large part thanks to the help from her parents. 她的大部分房租开支很大程度上来自于她父母的帮助。
All right, welcome back. So yes, From Yellow Journalism to Fake News is the title of our article. Let's check out the first sentence, which reads, The creation of false news content, also known as fake news, is a serious global problem. Absolutely. Anyone who's been paying attention to the news in the last few years knows that fake news is a serious problem. It's keeping people misinformed, having people disagree on facts, and it's even led to some very serious crimes in certain parts of the world. When we use this word creation, we're talking about making things. When you create, that's the verb form of this noun, you make something for the first time or you make something new. So creation is something that we think of that inventors and artists might pursue. That's something that they're trying to do or make or build for the first time. And also when you're writing things, when you're thinking up a recipe or even just humming a new song in your head, you are in an act of creation. You're making something new. And when we talk about content, well, content is one of those big words that covers lots of things. If someone was telling me about a certain book they read, I would say, well, what's the content of the book? What's in the book? What is the book about? Is it a fictional story? Is it nonfiction? Tell me about some of the characters, some of the plot. What is in a thing is its content. So news content would be basically the things you read in the newspaper, the stories you read in the paper, the stories you see on TV, or of course the stories that are written and put on a news website. So false news content, and here we have a simple way of thinking of it, also known as fake news, is a serious global problem. Thanks in part to social media, we read next, lies about important topics such as the COVID-19 pandemic or the climate crisis are able to spread like wildfire across the internet.
That's right, Mike. It's a really serious problem all over the world. And I think when people hear the words fake news, I think in recent history, we often think about Donald Trump. When he disagrees with anything, he says it's fake news. I think that's probably an example that is quite recent. And so people probably recognize that example. And the reason why a lot of these fake news messages are spreading so fast is because of social media. You know, when I was growing up, we had maybe 3 news channels. We only had 3 sources on television for the news and maybe about 3 or 4 newspapers that we could find the news in. But today, there are just so many websites, they call themselves news websites, where we can get information about current events. And so people don't really know where to look, and often you get trapped into believing fake news. So thanks in large part to social media, it means that social media is largely or mostly responsible for spreading fake news because today, we're so busy, most people don't have time to look for news, so most people get their news from social media. Particularly hot button topic has been COVID-19 pandemic. There have been facts and there have been alternative facts about the pandemic. Some people agree that vaccines work. Then there'll be another publication that says no, vaccines don't work, they're dangerous. So where people usually disagree, sometimes they have information to back up what they're saying, but other times they're just using a lot of big words to create emotions. And that's what fake news often does. It will create a lot of strong feelings, which will spread like wildfire across the internet. So when we think about wildfire, we think of something that is totally uncontrollable. I think about the wildfires in California or even in my hometown, Cape Town. So when the weather is particularly dry, fire will spread really fast and there's no stopping it. So it will just keep on going and burn a path of destruction. However, the next sentence reads, however, although today's technology allows fake news to spread faster than ever before, the phenomenon itself is far from modern.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. When we say something is far from, and then we'll often use another adjective, we're basically saying it's really not that. So it's not a modern problem. It's far from that. So from that, you can get the idea that this is something that's been a problem for a very long time. So let's have a look at the second part of our article. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back to talk about it. Indeed, one can see the seeds of today's fake news crisis being planted more than 100 years ago in 19th century New York. During that time, however, the practice was known by a different name, yellow journalism. All right, we are back. So we have a short couple of sentences here for the second part of our article. We're looking at the history of fake news and kind of where it started. You might think it started more recently in the last 10 or 20 years with the spread of social media and news websites that maybe don't check their facts as well as some of the more well-known newspapers or television news stations. But in fact, the history of fake news goes back a long way. It says, indeed, one can see the seeds of today's today's fake news crisis being planted more than 100 years ago in 19th century New York. Well, New York has always been a center of media. I think the media today in New York, for the most part, is much more responsible than the media they had back in the 19th century. That's, of course, the 1800s. When we see the seeds of today's problem or the seeds of today's fake news, that's kind of saying the beginning. As the seed is the beginning of a plant, that's when you have the seed you put in the ground, and then it will grow, it will develop, it will change over time. But that's sort of the origin of it. So what was happening back in 19th century New York?
During that time, the practice in New York was known as yellow journalism.
Yellow journalism. Very interesting term.
Yeah, it is. And that was named after a cartoon or a comic strip in one of the newspapers. When we talk about a practice, the practice of yellow journalism really is a way of doing things. So it's a custom or a tradition. For example, it is common practice in some Western countries, or in a lot of Western countries really, to tip for different services, but it's not in Asia. So that isn't a practice that is very well known or practiced here in Asia.
That's right. And notice here we're using practice as a noun, not the way we would more commonly use it, practicing like your guitar or your piano or something. As a verb, when you're getting ready or developing your skills, you're practicing. Here we're using it in a different way. We can also talk about a doctor's practice. That's kind of their career or where they do their work or something like that. So using it as a noun, it's a little bit different from how we might use it as a verb. Okay, that's the second part of our article. Now we're really going to dial down and find out about yellow journalism back in 19th century New York in the third and final part of our article. So let's listen to that. During the 1880s and 1890s, two New York newspapers, the New York World and the New York Journal, were engaged in a war for readers. To attract as many as possible, these papers continually tried to outdo each other. They would print misleading headlines, fake interviews, and pages upon pages of half-truths, anything to get people's eyes on their pages. The term yellow journalism came from a popular cartoon character called the Yellow Kid, whose comic strip featured in both of these newspapers. Eventually, it became used to describe sensationalist journalistic practices in general.
第三部分我们看到形容词 engaged 表示卷入点点点的，或是忙于点点点的，或是订婚的。例如 Jack was engaged in a difficult homework problem when his mother called him for dinner. 当 Jack 的妈妈叫他吃饭时，他正忙于一个困难的家庭作业。或是 Ed and Norma just got engaged and their wedding is next month. Ed 和 Norma 刚订婚，他们的婚礼在下个月。另外补充这个字的动词 engage E-N-G-A-G-E engage 表示从事点点点或是忙于点点点。举例来说 Melody engages in various activities after school. Melody 在放学后从事各种活动。也可以说 The teacher engaged his students in lively discussions. 老师让学生进行热烈讨论。接着我们看到单字 outdo 这个字是动词，指胜过、超越，像是 The businessman loves to try and outdo his competitors. 这名商人热爱想尽办法胜过竞争对手。或者 Some people always try to outdo others when they tell stories of similar experiences. 有些人在讲述类似经历的故事时，总是试图超越他人。另外补充这个字的相关用法 not to be outdone. Outdone, O-U-T-D-O-N-E, not to be outdone, 表示不甘示弱或是不遑多让。例如 Not to be outdone by Apple, Google dove into the mobile app market. 不让 Apple 专美于前， Google 也投入行动应用程式市场。或是 Not to be outdone, Ron brought up a proposal in the meeting to compete with his coworkers. Ron 不甘示弱，在会议上提案来和同事的提案一较高下。 最后我们看到动词 mislead 指误导或是使点点点产生错误想法。举例来说 I would have dressed casually, but I was misled into thinking that this was a formal party. 我本来要穿随性一点，但我被误导以为这个是个正式的派对。也可以说 Many people were misled into thinking that the man was a famous actor. 许多人误以为那名男子是知名演员。
And we are back. So there you go. During the 1880s and 1890s, two New York newspapers, the New York World and the New York Journal, were engaged in a war for readers. So it kind of came out of competition between these two businesses, these two newspapers. That's why it's described as a war. Of course, they weren't fighting and shooting and throwing bombs at each other. It's the same way that companies might have a war for customers, the way that Netflix and other streaming services might be in a war for your dollars. It's basically a business competition. And when you take part in something, you can engage in something. It's a bit more of a formal term. We wouldn't use it that often, but maybe in your writing or in your reading, you might see he was engaged in a crime or something. They were doing something. Something was happening at that time. So there was some kind of battle between these newspapers. Not really a battle to control the politics of the city necessarily, just a battle to sell more newspapers. So how did they go about doing that, Candace?
To attract as many readers as possible, these papers continually try to outdo each other, right? So at that time, there was an ongoing competition. So continually suggests that it wasn't a once-off. It was happening on a regular basis and over a period of time.
Maybe even over years or something.
Yes, possibly. And they were trying to outdo each other. Now, another phrase that we often use is one-up, which means that they're trying to get one over on their competition or do something better or more outrageous than the other. For example, in business, if we have two similar businesses, they might try to outdo each other by offering lower prices or more interesting products to win over more customers.
So it's kind of a competition, but a continual competition. You're not sort of saying you're going to beat the other team and that's it, the game's over, we win, you lose. This is more like, think of a brother and sister who are always trying to compete to show off to their parents. And this would go on over years, right? Comparing their test scores, comparing their athletic achievements and stuff like that. And they're always trying to get a little step ahead of that person they're constantly battling with. So how would they try to attract more readers? It says they would print misleading headlines, fake interviews, and pages upon pages of half-truths. Anything to get people's eyes on their pages. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, to what some of the websites and newspapers and television news stations do today. Misleading headlines. So a headline, of course, is the top thing, the big writing you see at the head or the top of the newspaper page, right? It's, I might say, U.S. President visits Russia or something like that. And then below that will be the main article. If something is misleading, it's not exactly a lie, but it's certainly not the truth. It's kind of picking the facts to make you think a certain thing and leaving out the facts that might actually give you the full picture. When you're misleading someone, you're kind of walking that thin line between a lie and the truth, and you're certainly saying it to get the person you're telling this information to believe a certain way and to avoid them thinking about other things that might be bad for you. So they would print these misleading headlines. They would print fake interviews as if they'd sat down to talk to a famous person, but they never had. They just made up the answers that this person would give them. I don't think that happens too much these days. You'd probably get sued by the person if you did that. And also pages upon pages of half-truths. If it's a half-truth, it's probably misleading. You're leaving out a lot of the facts. You're only giving people half of the truth or half of the correct information. All of this was to get people's eyes on their pages. That's just another way of saying getting people to buy their newspapers.
Yeah, and while misleading isn't an outright lie,
No.
we always get chastened for lying, but it does lead people to believe something that isn't 100% true. As you said, they're not in possession of all the facts. They don't have all the facts or information. So an example of this would be, for example, EV is quite a big thing at the moment, electric vehicles. Chinese EV sales numbers include hybrid cars. Now, a hybrid car is a car that uses electricity as well as gas. So even though the figures are not 100% incorrect, they're not 100% correct either, because their EV sales reporting is misleading.
So that's why it's always good to get the facts for yourself. So then we learn about where the term yellow journalism actually came from. And it's kind of an interesting story, right?
Yeah, the term yellow journalism came from a popular cartoon character called the Yellow Kid, whose comic strip featured in both of these newspapers.
Interesting. Okay, so today they might call it Charlie Brown journalism or Snoopy journalism. These comic strips, these are short little 3-picture, usually stories that are told with some of those famous characters you might know from other cartoons. But Peanuts, the one with Snoopy and Charlie Brown, that's a popular one that's been in newspapers for decades all around the world. So there was this one character back in the old day. He wasn't Doraemon, he wasn't Hello Kitty, he wasn't Snoopy, he was Yellow Kid. So because these newspapers both carried this comic strip, they called it yellow journalism. And eventually it says it became used to describe sensationalist journalistic practices in general. Well, something sensational is something that will make you go, wow, and make you tell, hey, did you see this? This is amazing. It's going to blow your mind. So it's something very exciting. It'll get a big emotional reaction, probably cause you to definitely sit up and take notice, but it might not be entirely true. It's kind of like advertising, I guess, in a way. It's supposed to get you to feel something without really thinking too much about what you're seeing. And that's basically what these yellow journalists were doing. And here we have this term journalistic. All right. So doing something that a journalist does, writing in a newspaper. If you're a reporter, you're having a journalistic career, I suppose. Not a word we use very often, but anything to do with reporters, reporting, journalists, working for newspapers and whatnot. We could use this term journalistic. So yeah, they were printing a lot of news. It wasn't really factual, but it certainly was good at driving newspaper sales. And unfortunately, I guess the editors and bosses of these papers weren't really worried about delivering the truth to the population. They were worried about selling papers.
Yes, it's all about that bottom line. People
Absolutely.
are interested in the profit.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. So we're going to wrap it up, and now it's time to go and listen to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分的最后一句写道，虽然现今的科技能够让假新闻比以往任何时候都散播得更快，他说 The phenomenon itself is far from modern， 这种现象本身绝非现代才有。那这边我们来学习 be far from 的用法。第一种呢，我们可以用 be far from 去表达距离上远离点点点，像是 The shopping mall is far from here， 那间购物中心离这里很远。好，那么第二个我们可以用 be far from 去表达一点也不、绝不，完全相反，意思呢就会跟 not at all 差不多。我们可以用 be far from 加形容词或名词去表达一点也不怎么样，远非什么什么。举例来说 Their marriage is far from perfect， 他们的婚姻离完美很远，那就表示说他们的婚姻并不完美，称不上完美。好，那同学们想要表达一点也不点点点的时候，你除了用 far from 或者是 not 点点点 at all， 我们也来补充两个意思差不多的用法。第一个是 anything but， 字面意思是任何东西，但不是点点点，这就表示说根本不是点点点。好，那么 anything but 后面可以接名词或形容词去表达绝非、根本不、 一点也不点点点的那种意思。那么这边的 but 是当介系词去表达除了什么什么之外。举例来说 The exam was anything but easy， 或者是 The exam was not easy at all， 就可以表达那个考试一点也不简单。第二个补充的是 nowhere near，它的意思就跟 not at all 或者是 not nearly 相同，表示跟什么差距甚远，一点也不接近。那么 nowhere near 后面可以接形容词或副词去强调一点也不怎么样，远不及，差得远的意思。举例来说 The project is nowhere near finished， 那个专案离完成还差得远呢。好，在我们看到课文第3部分有一个单字是 misleading， 它是用 mislead 的现在分词来当形容词去描述误导的，而 mislead 是由字首 mis 表示错误的，然后加上字根 lead 表示带领引导，合在一起 mislead 就是误导或者是使什么产生错误想法。我们顺便来学 mis 这个字首哦。好 miss 这个字首它可以表达不好、错误、缺乏等等那种否定不适宜的意思。那这个字首跟动词结合的时候，它的三态变化就会跟原本那个动词相同了。以下补充几个有相同字首的单字咯。第一个是 misunderstand， 用 miss 错误加上 understand 了解理解，合在一起 misunderstand 就表示误解误会。那第二个补充的是 misuse， 这个 miss 表示不当， use 是使用，结合在一起 misuse 就是误用使用不当。那么第三个 mistrust， 这个 miss 表示缺乏， trust 是信任，合在一起 mistrust 就是表达猜疑不信任的意思了。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Creation. Building a factory near the town will result in the creation of new jobs. Content. He used to be my favorite YouTuber, but he hasn't released any interesting content recently. Engaged. The students were engaged in conversation when the teacher entered the room. Continually. The chef is continually creating new and exciting dishes for his restaurant. Mislead. People accuse the politician of trying to mislead the voters. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I'm Candice.
See you next time.